The ballroom was alive with the kind of wealth that hummed. Crystal chandeliers threw light across Italian marble floors. Men in tailored suits laughed too loudly. Women in designer gowns moved like they had always belonged in rooms like this. The New York Elite Business Gala was not just a party, it was a performance, and everyone had a role to play. Nina stood near the far edge of the room, one hand holding a glass of water she hadn't touched, the other holding the small, warm hand of her 7-year-old daughter, Maya. She wore a deep burgundy gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent, but she wore it the way she wore everything, quietly, without needing anyone to notice. Her posture was straight, her face was composed, but her eyes moved slowly across the room, tracking one person the way you track something you've learned to be careful around. John. Her husband was across the room, dressed in a charcoal suit that she had actually picked out for him 3 weeks ago. He was laughing. Not just smiling, laughing. The full kind. The kind that reached his eyes and made him look 10 years younger. Nina couldn't remember the last time he had laughed like that with her. She stood very still, watching, and then she saw her. Sarah. Sarah Chambers, his business partner. She had her hand lightly on John's arm, her head tilted toward him as she said something that made him laugh again. She was beautiful in the way that felt intentional. Red dress, perfect hair, the kind of confidence that doesn't apologize for taking up space. John said something back to Sarah. Then, without looking, without turning, he walked directly past Nina, past his wife, past his daughter. He didn't stop. He didn't touch Nina's shoulder or squeeze Maya's hand or even glance in their direction. He simply passed them like they were part of the furniture, still talking to Sarah, still wearing that smile that Nina hadn't seen aimed at her in years. Maya watched her father walk past. She was quiet for a moment, the way children are quiet when they're trying to understand something that doesn't make sense to them. Then she tugged the hem of Nina's gown and looked up. "Mommy," Maya said softly. "Did Daddy forget us?" Nina looked down at her daughter. She felt something tighten in her chest, not a new pain, but an old one that had been pressed on in exactly the right spot. She knelt slowly, smoothing Maya's hair back from her face, and she smiled. The smile cost her something. "No, baby," she said. "Daddy's just busy." Maya looked across the room at her father, then back at her mother. She didn't look convinced. 7-year-olds rarely are. Nina had loved John Adeyemi before he was anyone. She needed people to understand that. Before the gala invitations, and the Manhattan penthouse, and the black cards, and the business profile features, there was a different John. A hungrier one. The kind who came home with his tie loosened and his eyes worried, sitting at their small kitchen table in their 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, spreading papers across the surface like a man trying to solve a puzzle before the world ran out of time. "Talk to me," Nina would say, sitting across from him, pushing a plate of food toward him that he would eat without tasting. "The Hendricks deal might fall through," he'd say. "If it does, we're 2 months from being under." "It won't fall through." "You don't know that." "I know you. That's enough." She had meant it. Every word of it. Nina was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. She had left Lagos at 23 with a finance degree, a job offer, and the kind of quiet ambition that doesn't announce itself. She had met John at a networking event where neither of them was supposed to be successful yet. They had talked for 4 hours. She had seen in him what he couldn't yet see in himself. A sharpness, a hunger, a mind that worked fast when it trusted itself. She had fallen in love with his potential and then stayed through the years it took for that potential to become real. She had edited his pitch decks at midnight. She had called investors on his behalf using her own network, her own credibility, her own reputation. She had talked him off the ledge after 3 failed deals in a single year. She had carried the weight of their household, so he could carry the weight of his dreams. And when Maya came, their miracle, their loud, bright, perpetually curious daughter, Nina had somehow found a way to carry that too, without ever making John feel like she was keeping score. She wasn't keeping score. She was building something. She thought they both were. But somewhere between the first million and the 10th, between the Brooklyn apartment and the Westchester mansion, between the man who needed her and the man who had stopped seeing her, something had shifted. And Nina, who noticed everything, had noticed the shift long before she was ready to name it. Sarah had come back into John's life about 18 months ago, introduced as a strategic business partner with connections in the European market. Nina had shaken her hand at dinner and felt nothing alarming. Sarah was polished, professional, and clearly intelligent. Nina was not a jealous woman. She had never needed to be. But Sarah had a way of making herself necessary. It started with meetings that ran late, then trips to Chicago, to London, to Dubai. Then it became phone calls in the other room, laughter she could hear through doors, a new energy in John that he was no longer directing at home. "You've been gone a lot," Nina said one evening. John was loosening his tie at the mirror, barely looking at her. "It's a critical period for the firm," he said. "It's always a critical period." He glanced at her reflection. "What does that mean?" "It means Maya asked me this morning if Daddy lives here anymore." John was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll take her to school tomorrow," and walked into the bathroom, and that was the end of the conversation. He did not take Maya to school the next morning. He had an early call. Nina drove Maya to school, and when Maya pressed her face against the car window and said, "Maybe he'll come to my show on Friday," Nina said, "Maybe," and kept her eyes on the road. He did not come to Maya's school performance on Friday. Nina sat in the front row of the school auditorium and watched her daughter scan the audience 3 times before the curtain rose, looking for a face that wasn't there. Maya was playing a small tree in the class production. She had exactly 1 line, and she delivered it with the kind of conviction that only children performing for their parents can manage. But halfway through her moment on stage, her eyes swept the audience one final time, found her mother's face, and something in her small expression settled into a quiet sadness that no 7-year-old should carry. Nina clapped the loudest in the room. She whistled. She stood up. She made sure Maya saw her standing. But on the drive home, Maya was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Did Daddy see the video?" "I took a great video," Nina said. "The best one." "But he wasn't there." Nina gripped the steering wheel. "No, baby, he wasn't." "Is it because I wasn't good enough?" Nina pulled the car over. She put it in park in the middle of a quiet street and turned fully to face her daughter. "Maya Adeyemi," she said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were not. "You were the most magnificent tree I have ever seen in my entire life. Do you hear me? There is nothing about you that is not enough. Do you understand me?" Maya looked at her for a long moment. "Then why didn't he come?" Nina had no answer for that. She reached out, pulled her daughter into her arms, and held her. Maya let herself be held, and Nina sat in that parked car on a quiet street and felt something inside her begin, very slowly, to harden. The dinner table had become a particular kind of quiet. Not the comfortable silence of 2 people who know each other well, but the other kind. The kind that has things moving beneath it. John would sit at the head of the table with his phone beside his plate, glancing at it every few minutes. Maya would talk about school, about her friend Chloe's hamster, about a book she was reading. And John would say, in the right places without actually listening. Nina would watch him not listen to their daughter and feel something corrode slowly inside her. "Daddy," Maya said one evening, spearing a piece of chicken. "Will you come next time? To my art show? It's in 3 weeks." John looked up from his phone. "When is it?" "3 weeks. Miss Carter says my painting is really good. She said it shows emotional maturity." Maya said emotional maturity with great seriousness, clearly having practiced the phrase. John almost smiled. "We'll see, Maya. You always say, 'we'll see,' because things come up. But it's 3 weeks away. Nothing has come up yet." John looked at Nina as though she should manage this. Nina looked back at him and said nothing. She was done managing things for him. She picked up her fork and kept eating. Maya stared at her father for a moment longer. Then she looked down at her plate and said quietly, "Okay, we'll see." The way she said it, like she had already accepted the disappointment, was the most devastating thing Nina had heard in months. It was 2 weeks after that dinner that Nina found the message. She hadn't been looking. She had picked up John's phone to check the time because hers was charging across the room, and the screen had lit up with a preview notification before she could put it down. She didn't read it fully. She didn't need to. 3 words and a name were enough. The kind of 3 words you send at midnight that don't belong to a business partnership. Nina set the phone down on the nightstand, carefully, as if it were something fragile. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Then she lay down, pulled the covers up, and closed her eyes. She said nothing. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not for the next week. She became, outwardly, exactly who she had always been. She made breakfast. She drove Maya to school. She attended the board meeting of her own quietly growing investment portfolio, the one she had been building slowly, carefully, mostly in her own name, guided by instincts that had never failed her. She had lunch with 2 women who happened to be the silent partners behind 3 of the largest infrastructure deals in the Northeast. She smiled. She was gracious. She was sharp. And she began, without dramatics, without announcements, to move. The night everything broke was a Tuesday. Maya woke at 2 a.m. with a fever so high she was shaking. Nina had her hand on her daughter's forehead before she was fully awake herself, and she felt the heat and was on her feet immediately. "Okay, baby. Okay. I've got you." She dressed Maya quickly, grabbed her bag, her keys, her insurance cards — she always knew where everything was — and got her daughter into the car. The hospital was 20 minutes away. Nina drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand reaching back to hold Maya's, talking to her the whole way. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Talk to me. Tell me about Chloe's hamster. What's the hamster's name again?" "Gerald," Maya whispered. "Gerald. That's a very serious name for a hamster." "He's a very serious hamster." Maya's voice was thin and tired, but she almost smiled. "Almost there," Nina said. "I've got you." She called John from the hospital waiting room while a nurse took Maya's vitals. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She sent a text. "Maya is in the hospital. High fever. Please call me." She sent it twice. She sat in the plastic chair and watched the door through which they had taken her daughter, and she called John one more time. He did not answer. 4,000 miles away, John was at a beachside resort in the Maldives, which he had described to his assistant as a strategic retreat. He was at dinner with Sarah, candlelight between them, the sound of the ocean nearby. His phone was on silent. He had put it on silent himself earlier in the evening, when Nina had texted him about a school schedule conflict he hadn't responded to. He hadn't wanted the interruption. Nina sat alone in the hospital for 5 hours. She signed every form herself. She answered every question herself. She held Maya's hand through the IV insertion while Maya cried, and she did not cry herself because she needed to be steady. The doctor told her at 4 a.m. that the fever had broken, that Maya was stable, that they had caught it in time. If you'd waited another few hours, he said, it could have been significantly worse. I know, Nina said. Thank you. She sat beside Maya's bed in the pale, hospital light and watched her daughter sleep. Maya's face was exhausted, but peaceful now. Her hand was warm in Nina's. The IV dripped quietly. The monitors beeped in a slow, reassuring rhythm. Nina did not cry. She had passed the place where tears were available to her. She sat in the silence and felt, with great clarity, the exact shape of the decision she had already made. She did not pack everything. She took what mattered, her documents, Maya's documents, the contents of her own accounts, which had always been separate, and which John had always found slightly amusing, her insistence on financial independence. She took Maya's drawings. She took a photograph from Maya's first birthday, the one where all three of them were laughing at something off camera, and John still looked at Nina the way he used to. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the house, the marble countertops, the imported light fixtures, the too large dining table that always felt empty no matter how many people sat at it. She felt nothing for the house. She had never loved it the way she had loved the Brooklyn apartment, which smelled like old wood and ambition and possibility. She took off her wedding ring. She placed it on the kitchen table, in the center, where he would see it immediately. She stood there for a moment with her bare hand. Then she picked up her daughter's small backpack, took Maya's hand, and walked to the front door. She did not slam it. She pulled it closed behind her, softly, like a period at the end of a very long sentence, and she walked to her car without looking back. John came home to silence. He noticed the absence before he registered what it meant. The quality of the air in the house was different. Still, in a way, it never was, even when Nina was reading quietly or Maya was napping. He set his luggage down in the foyer and called out. Nothing. He walked into the kitchen and saw the ring. He stood looking at it for a long time. Then he picked it up. It was lighter than he expected, or maybe he just hadn't held it in so long, he had forgotten its weight. He set it back down. He pulled out his phone and called Nina. It rang twice, then, "You've reached Nina. Please leave a message." Professional. Clean. Her voicemail had always sounded like that, like someone who had their life organized. He called again. Same result. He texted, "Nina, where are you? Where is Maya?" He stood in the kitchen of his 7,000 square foot house and listened to the silence and felt, not devastated, not yet, but unsettled. Like a man who has missed a step in the dark. He told himself she would call. She would come back. She was making a point. Nina was always making some quiet point or another. He poured himself a drink and sat in the living room and waited. And when she hadn't called by midnight, he told himself she was dramatic, that she would be back by morning, and he went to bed. She did not come back by morning. Or the morning after that. He called her mother in Lagos, who told him, in a voice as warm as ice water, "She's fine. Maya is fine. They are together." And then, "John, you should think about the kind of man you have become." And she hung up. It was around that time that the business calls started going differently. Marcus Webb, the lead investor on John's biggest current deal, a real estate development in 3 major cities, called to say he was reconsidering the timeline. 3 days later, he pulled out entirely. His assistant cited changed priorities. Then Denise Okafor, who controlled the funding for John's Chicago expansion, went quiet. Then the Callahan Group declined to renew their partnership agreement. In 2 weeks, John watched 4 pillars of his business portfolio begin to crack. He didn't understand it. He called people. People were polite but vague. Timelines were shifting. Priorities had changed. The market, someone said. He hired a consultant who spent 2 weeks looking at the situation and came back with a summary that made John's stomach drop. Several of your key financial relationships appear to have been influenced by a common contact. Someone with significant pull in these circles appears to have quietly withdrawn their support or encouraged others to. John sat with that for a long moment. Then he thought about Nina's lunches, her phone calls, the quiet meetings she went to that he had never asked about, the investment portfolio she managed as a hobby that he had found vaguely amusing for years, her connections, people she knew from her career, from Lagos, from the circles she had maintained and nurtured while he had taken her for granted at every gala and dinner and event where she stood quietly by his side. He had never once asked her what she was building. He had just assumed she was supporting him. He called Sarah. Sarah didn't answer. He called again the next day. She picked up this time, her voice professional in a way it had never been with him. "John, I think we need to take a step back from the partnership." "What does that mean?" "The firm is going through a restructuring. We're reducing our external exposure." "Sarah," his voice was flat. "What is happening?" A pause. Then, "I think you should focus on stabilizing things on your end. I'll have my lawyers send over the dissolution paperwork." And that was it. She was gone. The woman he had gambled his marriage for had looked at his situation, assessed the value, and walked away with the same efficiency she had walked toward him. He found Maya's drawing on a Thursday. He had been going through Maya's room, sitting in her absence, which was the worst kind of absence, a child-shaped hole in the air, when he found the drawing in her desk drawer. She had made it at school, months ago. He recognized her style, bold, colorful, the figures slightly too big for the page, the way children always draw people, full of size and importance. There was a woman with a crown who was obviously Nina, and a small girl with curly hair who was obviously Maya. And in the corner, where the father figure should have been, a man in a suit, drawn but then crossed out. Not erased, crossed out, like something canceled, like something she had given up on. John sat on his daughter's bed and held that drawing for a very long time. He didn't hear himself make a sound at first. He didn't know he was crying until he felt his face was wet. It came up from somewhere deep and unguarded, the tears of a man who had spent years building armor and had just found it rusted all the way through. He thought about Maya searching the audience at her school performance. He heard her voice. Did Daddy forget us? He thought about Nina in the hospital alone at 2 a.m., signing forms, holding their daughter's hand, while he was at dinner with his phone on silent. He thought about the ring on the kitchen table, the soft click of the door, how he had slept while his wife took their child and left, and he hadn't even known. He was alone in the house, and there was no one to hear him come apart. And somehow, that was the worst part. Not that it hurt, but that he had made himself someone whose pain had no audience. He had cleared the room himself, slowly, over years, one ignored moment at a time. 2 years is long enough for a life to take a completely different shape. The International Investment Summit was held annually at the Grand Meridian Hotel in Manhattan. It was the kind of event that mattered, not flashy, but substantial, attended by people who moved money in ways that moved the world. John was there because he was still in the game. Barely. He had rebuilt some of what he'd lost, painstakingly, humbling himself in ways he hadn't thought possible. He was relevant enough to be in the room. He was no longer significant enough to be at the front of it. He saw her from across the hall, and his chest stopped. Nina walked through the room the way water moves, without effort, without announcement, but shaping everything it touched. She wore a white suit that was almost architectural. Her hair was up. She was speaking to a man John recognized as one of the most powerful private equity players in the country, and the man was leaning toward her, listening, in the way people lean toward someone whose time is worth something. She had a glass of champagne in her hand, a smile on her face, and a presence that the room had already rearranged itself to accommodate. Beside her, Maya. Maya was 9 now. She wore a navy dress and small heels that she was managing with the careful focus of a child who refuses to wobble. She had her mother's posture. She had Nina's eyes and John's chin, and a gravity about her that she hadn't had 2 years ago. She watched the room the way her mother did, taking everything in, giving little away. John walked toward them. He couldn't not. He moved across the hall, and when he was 10 feet away, Maya looked up and saw him. She did not run to him. She did not smile the unguarded way she used to, the whole-face smile of a daughter who expects to be caught. She looked at him with a steadiness that was not coldness exactly, but was something adjacent to it, the look of a child who had learned to wait, who had learned what it cost to hope too fast. She stepped back, very slightly, and she stood just behind her mother's shoulder. That small step backward. That was the thing. Not Nina's composure. Not the way the room respected her. Not the business he had lost, or the woman who had left him, or the ring on the table. It was that one small step his daughter took backward when she saw him. That was what landed in the center of his chest like something with weight and edge. Nina turned. She had seen him walking over. She looked at him with a calm that was absolute. There was no malice in it. There was no warmth either. She looked at him the way you look at something that used to be significant and no longer is, with a kind of archaeological detachment, as though he were an artifact from an earlier period of her life. "John," she said. "Nina." His voice came out thinner than he intended. "You look—" "Thank you," she said, before he could finish. Smooth. Practiced. She didn't need his observations about how she looked. He glanced at Maya. "Hi, sweetheart." Maya looked up at him. A pause. "Hi." Her voice was not unfriendly, but it was careful. It was the voice of a child who had decided, somewhere in the past 2 years, that she would no longer do the emotional labor of making him comfortable. He stood there with everything he wanted to say, caught in his throat. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I missed the performance and the hospital and the drawings and the mornings and all of it. And none of it came out, because the words were too large and the moment too small." And Nina's eyes told him, without cruelty, that this was neither the time nor the place. And perhaps there was no longer a time or place for it. "Excuse us," Nina said pleasantly. She placed her hand on Maya's shoulder, and they turned together. Mother and daughter, a complete unit, an entire world, and walked back toward the man from private equity, back toward the life she had built without him, back toward everything she had become while he was looking somewhere else. John stood in the middle of the Grand Meridian ballroom and watched them go. He did not move for a long time. He would think later, in the quiet of his apartment, which was smaller now, and which he had learned to be honest about, in the way that losing things teaches you honesty. He would think about that night in Brooklyn, about Nina at the kitchen table, pushing food toward him, saying, "I know you." That's enough. He would think about how she had meant it, how absolutely, fully, quietly she had meant it. And he would think about what it takes, what it costs a person, to offer that kind of faith to someone who gradually stops showing up to receive it. He would think about Maya's drawing, the crossed-out figure in the corner, the father-shaped space she had finally stopped saving. He had spent years building an empire, and while he was building it, someone had been building herself. He had just never thought to look. He had mistaken her stillness for absence, her patience for smallness, her quiet for having nothing to say. He had made that mistake for years, slowly, one ignored moment at a time, until the morning he came home to a ring on a table and a door that had been closed without a sound. Not with anger. That was the thing. Not with a scene. Not with accusations. Not with the dramatic exit he might have given her. Just softly, decisively, like a woman who had already done her grieving and was now simply moving forward. He had not understood, until it was over, that the most powerful thing she had ever done to him was leave quietly. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself in Nina's patience, in Maya's small backward step, in the silence of a house that used to hold love, then you already understand why stories like this matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me, whose side were you on from the beginning? And if you believe that real strength is quiet, that love is not a background feature, that the people who show up in the small moments are the ones worth fighting to keep, hit that subscribe button, because the stories we tell here are always about that. Like this video, because it helps more people find it. And drop your thoughts below. I read every single one. The ones who love in silence are rarely the ones who deserve to be ignored.